by disconnectedness, contradiction, or incompatibility among first principles. So if you've got a system where everything is going like, passing like ships in the night and things are at cross purposes, it means that the people who make up that collective system of action, like the educational system in these 5 cities, do not share a common system of thought. And it means when you have committee meetings to decide something, nobody knows what the underlying system of thought is that everybody's buying into, and consequently, the most you will get out of the meeting is fatigue, maybe a little bit of therapy for somebody who likes to talk a lot, but not too much action that is significant or will lead to any change of any import. Now again, we've simply interviewed hundreds of people and asked them informally and even formally, what's the worst thing you hate about your profession? And a lot of people put too many meetings that don't go anywhere pretty near the top of the list. There are other things too low pay and, you know, lots of things. But meetings that don't go anywhere are among those that are very high on the list. And that's in part because the people who are talking don't share a common frame of reference. So that even though they may be using the same words, these same words do not mean the same thing. I remember when I first went to Oxford to study and had my first invitation out to a home, a lovely home with beautiful gardens and so on. And that's when I found out that English in England and English in America are not the same language necessarily. I heard my host say to his wife, when I began scraping the dishes and sort of helping red up the dishes after the meal, he said, "This young man is very homely." And I found myself taking a peek in the mirror as I walked by shortly after that. Because in England, homely means inclined towards domestic activities. Whereas we have an expression in Nebraska where I was raised, so-and-so's homely as a mud fence. Homely means ugly. In England, it's a compliment. Here, it's an insult. Well, it wasn't within 10 minutes that we were outdoors, and I returned the insult by saying how beautiful her yard was. In England, a yard is sort of actually a literal square yard of concrete where you keep the garbage cans. And she initially wondered why I should be commenting on the garbage cans when we had just seen 1.5 acres of heavenly English gardens. But the funny thing was, we had just passed the garbage cans. So that there was a little bit of doubt. If we hadn't even passed them, there wouldn't have been some doubt in her mind. And I found in England, at meetings, when you table something, it means you put it on the table, discuss it, and take action on it. Isn't it true in America when you table something, you decide not to do anything? Isn't that right? I can never remember now. I actually married an English woman, so I'm perpetually confused about lots of these things now. Spelling as well. In England, if you don't want to take action on something, you shelve it, not table it. Which makes some sense to me. I don't know, what do you call it in America when you decide not to take action? Well, the point is, a culture ordinarily provides people with a fundamental background of experience which endows the same words with very similar meanings. But in a profession like education, where we are learning more and more things and we're dealing with something so complex like human beings, the same words may be used in the sentence in the same way, and we may think we are understanding what somebody is saying, but we don't. And therefore, we don't have efficiency in the system because the system is not based on a body of coherent thought. So the purpose for requiring a first principle is that it brings coherence to a system of thought on which can be based then an efficient system of action. It facilitates coordination. It enables everybody who's involved to connect with everything that's being done and said. Now, our experience over the last 4 or 5 years in taking Anisa to the field has taught us that it takes a little while to do this, and that there's always some difficulties, and some people take to it a little more quickly than others, and essentially it boils down to the fact that any professional growth depends upon learning in doing new things. And if you're not willing to learn something new and do something in a new way, there won't be any growth. And that in the course of learning something new and doing something new, there will be some discouraging moments and some difficulties and some setbacks and so on. That's all a part of it. And in fact, if we didn't have those discouraging moments and those moments of anxiety and so on, we would, I think, go to sleep and be dead in our profession. In fact, people who want to have a life that's absolutely free from tension and difficulties are people who think that will bring them happiness, whereas in fact it's the definition of boredom, and that boredom leads to its own pathologies. And we were talking at lunch today about many affluent people who have bought themselves lives of miserable boredom. So I'm not saying this to promise you lots of headaches in the coming 3 years, but when one comes along, don't be upset, because there is a framework of thought that we've worked out for 16 years which will enable us together to generate a set of options of things to do that are likely to improve whatever issue or circumstance that happens to be causing the headache. If I were to take you through the 16 years, which is really what I want to do today, I could do it very quickly by showing you these overheads. This machine has developed a pathology a little bit. It got banged, and so it's not going to focus very well for us. But can you see that? We felt that we had to find a first principle, and that first principle would specify the view of man. And tomorrow, I'm going to talk about that in greater detail. And then from that, we derived a theory of development. And from that theory of development, we organized a coherent theory of teaching and a comprehensive theory of curriculum. And then we quickly became aware that you can have all that and have it beautiful, and then you try to make it work. And if you're working with administrators who don't understand all of this, with just the signature on a little piece of paper, they can shoot the whole thing down. And therefore, there had to be a compatible theory of administration to go with it. And then the whole system itself, in order to avoid its ever becoming static, had to have built into it a system of self-evaluation that would ensure its perpetual self-renewal. In fact, it specifies what kinds of data to collect on the whole system, and that may cause you to rethink your philosophical first principles. And when you do that, then it sends a ripple through the whole system again. But without something like that, you wouldn't get anything terribly comprehensive, nor would you get anything that would likely have the horsepower required to make a significant impact on education. When I started on this 16 years ago, I was very concerned because Head Start was just about ready to begin. And I went to the Head Start people, and I said, you know, I think I've cooked up a system of education here which would really make such a remarkable and significantly different impact on Head Start children. But I need about $2 or $3 million, and I need 5 years. They said, are you kidding? We have to be in business on Monday. And we're not in the business of thinking. before we act. We're just in the business of acting. Well, they didn't say it in quite those words, but that's really what came out. And I was foolish to think I could have done it in 5 years, although maybe with several $1,000,000 it might have been possible. Because the first thing we did, which I will go into more tomorrow, in order to avoid this reinvention of the wheel business, which I kept seeing time and time again, was that we reviewed the best thinking by the best minds in our civilized history on the nature of man. We started before Parmenides, perhaps the only significant philosopher before Plato, and came right up to the present day. It was an extraordinary journey, because none of us had been trained as philosophers. And there's an awful lot of words written out there, and we could understand why people are turned off in some cases by philosophy. Because there is an infinite number of things to be said about even uninteresting things. And philosophers often have managed to build whole careers on saying a million things about very uninteresting things. But when they talk about man, humanity, it becomes very interesting what people have thought. And we, in the course of that survey, became very much attracted to the work of Alfred North Whitehead, great musician, a great mathematician and logician, who later turned to philosophy. Alfred North Whitehead was at Cambridge University in England. His most brilliant pupil was Bertrand Russell. He later teamed up with his most brilliant pupil, and together they wrote the 3 volumes called Principia Mathematica, which sets forth the fundamentals of mathematical thought, and surely must stand as one of the towering achievements, intellectual achievements of the 20th century. After having done that, though, Whitehead came to the conclusion that mathematics as a system of thought was inadequate to illumine the nature of human beings. And he therefore accepted a chair to come from Cambridge to Cambridge, went to Harvard, took a chair in philosophy, and spent the mellowing years of his life as a philosopher. And he's written a lot of books. I'm sure you've probably read Aims of Education. Some of the other books are Adventure and Ideas, Modes of Thought, Science in the Modern World, Science in Philosophy, The Nature of Nature, and one work which is the kingpin of all the others called Process and Reality, which is his explanation of the ultimate nature of the universe and how man fits into it. Now, if we'd stumbled onto Whitehead first, it probably would have saved us a lot of trouble in many ways, because Whitehead's philosophy is in itself something of a remarkable synthesis of both Western and Eastern streams of philosophical thought. And I'm going to give you right now the 22nd version of Whitehead's cosmology, so that you have firmly in your mind one basic first principle on which this whole thing hinges. Whitehead says, what do you see when you look at the universe and all of creation? You see one thing most prevalent, and that is change. He said, the minute you talk about change, you are talking about process. And the minute you speak of process, you presuppose potentiality. And therefore, the fundamental reality underlying creation is process, which he defines as the translation of potentiality into actuality. That process, then, the translation of potentiality into actuality, which, incidentally, Whitehead states is the fundamental essence of creativity, the universal of universals. That fundamental process, the translation of potentiality into actuality, then, became for us the first principle underlying this model. And we said to ourselves, it is the function of education to facilitate the actualization of the potentialities of the child at an optimum rate. And that any pathology which the child is experiencing can be understood in terms of an impairment of that process. So that if a child has a learning disability or whatever, that process is going to be upset in some way. And it would be our job to find out where it is and apply an even more extensive body of theory, which you will come to learn, in order to find out what to do. So this educational system is based on that fundamental notion of creativity as defined by Whitehead. Now, for most of you, creativity may be thought of as something evident in a product which makes it different from all other products produced by ordinary people. And that's not our definition of creativity. That's the deviant from the norm definition of creativity. You know, if you have 50 children in a class and you send out a piece of paper and say, everybody write a poem, and all of them write a poem that's very similar to roses and red and violets are blue and so on, and then you get one who writes a haiku or something else, then you say, this child is creative. The others weren't. Well, that's the definition of creativity based upon the product of an effort which deviates from what everybody else is doing. Yet, the child who wrote his first poem, even if it is in the format of roses and red and violets, may for him be quite a creative step. And certainly the first physical step a child takes is an example of psychomotor creativity for that child, because it's actualizing a potentiality. So, if you can keep that first principle in your mind now, the rest of our 13 sessions will be derivative from that principle. And in fact, that's why we found out nobody has ever been able to create a comprehensive theory of curriculum or theory of pedagogy, because by definition, we found out logically, they must be derivative theories. And they must be derivative from a theory of development. And if you haven't got the theory of development, then you haven't got anything to derive it from. And therefore, the first principle that you'll be trying to cook up for this, even if you don't know you have to have one, there has to be a central proposition. It will probably not be central enough to produce what you really need. Now, when you take the idea of potentiality being translated into actuality, you are saying something is moving from condition A to condition B over time. And it's changing. And the sequence of those changes represent an ordered expression of potentiality, and that's what we call process. The ordered expression of potentiality. Now, when you plant an acorn, you know that within that acorn, potentially, there is an oak tree. This is why the potentiality of something is an unrealized, though real, part of anything and everything. Now, I want to make that point absolutely clear, because it influences the relationship that you have with another human being, if as a part of that relationship there is an acceptance of the potentiality of the child, which is by and large unknown and has to be taken on faith. Therefore, there is an element of faith and trust in every growth-promoting relationship. And if you haven't got that with your children, they will not be attracted to you very much. And if they're not attracted to you, they won't be able to learn very much. At least not as much as they would if you had that. Now, one of the propositions, as you will hear more fully tomorrow, and this is the last thing I'm going to say about the nature of human beings, because that's going to be tomorrow, is that we set forth as a basic proposition about the nature of man this one idea, namely that there was no scientific or theoretical justification for assuming that the potentialities of man are limited. And therefore, we take the position that every child is endowed with an infinitude of potentiality. Now, if you relate to a child on the basis of his limitations, he will not feel fully accepted. It's one of those curious things. But when you have a sense of this unlimited potentiality and that figures into your attitude to the child, then the child relates to you differently. And it makes a difference, that bond. As you'll see later in teaching, how important that bond is for effective teaching. And if you haven't got it, then you need to get it. And if you can't get it, then maybe there's another profession that would be better. Because I think that, I think though, that everybody, just by virtue of being a product of evolution, has the capacity to establish the kind of bond I'm talking about. But some will no doubt do it better than others. Now let me just place that basic idea in the context of evolution and then move on. Because I'm at 3:45, we're going to stop for a coffee break. And then there'll be some announcements, and I'm going to come back and finish the sweep through. We wanted a theory of development which would explain how you get from A to B. A theory of development that would explain the nature of process, would explain the nature of potentiality, and would let you know what actualized potentialities look like. And I'm telling you, there is no substitute for knowing what you're talking about in any business. And I've just found in myself sometimes talking utter nonsense when I ask myself, what do each of those words I'm using mean? And do I know? So you'll find that we're a bug on definition. And in order to be absolutely accurate, sometimes these definitions are pretty abstract. And they will take you a little while to assimilate. Once you get it, it changes your perceptions, and that's when you begin to see things differently. When you see things differently, you react differently, and that then involves the change in your behavior that represents your growth. Whitehead said, the sole justification for thought is action. And once your thinking changes and your perception changes, then it's automatic almost that your behavior would be able to change and you become more generative. So this theory of development then is designed to explain all the fundamentals about human potential and what you have to do to get it actualized and what those potentialities look like when they are actualized. That's why we called the focus on that is the reason underlying the name of our center at UMass, the Center for the Study of Human Potential. Now, we drummed up that name long time ago, before Esalen and a few of these other things that are going on. And so when I come to give a speech sometimes on, and they know I'm from the Center for the Study of Human Potential, particularly it's in California, they think I might have 20 pounds of beads and long hair, and that I'm advocating everybody jumping into a jacuzzi pool and without any clothes on and playing footsies or something. Well, you can see that, I mean, that might be all well and good, but that's not really the thrust of our effort. Our effort here is essentially an endeavor to produce a high level of penetrating insight into how human beings grow and develop so that we can facilitate that in the education professions. Incidentally, if you consider for just a moment what happens when human potential is suppressed, you get, in our opinion, two major pathologies. One, mental illness. Two, crime and juvenile delinquency. In fact, I read not too long ago an article which said that mental illness is a socially acceptable alternative to crime. And they are both responses to the suppression of potentiality. And my major theme song to the federal government for the last 15 years has been, let's create a system that promotes the actualization of human potential. It will do away with these pathologies, and we'll save a lot of money, because as it is now, young people who are coming up through a system and have their potentiality suppressed by whatever reason, if those young people tend to be extroverted, their reaction to the suppression is to strike out. And they run afoul of the law, they destroy property, they beat somebody up, whatever. They're apprehended, arrested, and put in a prison. If the person is introverted, in terms of personality orientation, they tend to withdraw. They go into a fantasy world. They go on drugs or alcohol. They go on welfare. And eventually they wind up in a mental hospital. So here are two major social institutions, mental hospitals and prisons, on which we spend billions of dollars annually trying to help people that have been derailed by the system that they've come up through. And there are many ways in which human beings are suppressed, have their potentiality suppressed. And one is being locked in a system by law which doesn't accommodate your developmental level, does not meet your developmental needs when the needs arise for as long as they exist. And schools are one basic institution that, by virtue of the way they are structured, will do that unless we make radical changes. For instance, we know one thing for certain. Individuals are unique, and they learn and grow and develop at different rates at different times. And even the rate alters. There may be a spurt, and then it may be very slow. And some children may be ready to read at 4, some not till 7. And you couldn't say one was abnormal in either direction over the other. So it follows from that then that grouping children for instructional purposes on the basis of chronological age is bad news. It is fundamentally a most misleading criterion for grouping children for instructional purposes. If the instruction focuses on the acquisition of certain knowledge which requires certain prerequisite developmental experiences. If you require it, when they don't have these prerequisites, you will set the child up for a guaranteed failure. We have examined in great detail what happens to a young person who is locked in a system in a way that guarantees his failure. And it's made worse if the system then turns around and makes the child feel like it's his fault. Now, of course, in recent years, the schools have come under the gun very much as being the cause of all this. And the truth of the matter is a lot of the stuff is already done because the kid doesn't get to school until he's 5. And you can't imagine all the things that can happen from the point of conception until the child reaches kindergarten. So that in fact, our aim is to work fundamentally with two basic institutions, families and schools, because these two institutions are in the most powerful position to influence the oncoming generation. And they are the ones who could, if they applied all this knowledge of human development and growth, actually avoid the pathologies. If you are talking about human potential, you've got to be able to say what they are, what the human potentialities are. And I want to give you now an abstract definition of a potential or a potentiality. And it will help you when you get stuck to go back to this definition, because it will free you from particulars. In fact, the great virtue of a theory is that you will be able to discern general patterns. And without being able to discern general patterns, you will not get a sense of what's going on. And you can't discern those general patterns if you can't abstract yourself from concrete particulars. Let me give you an example. Well, I'll just give you this definition first, and then give you an example. You know, the root word from which the word potential comes is the past participle of the verb to be. Those of you who took Latin. Sum est, sunt, which is a conjugation of the verb to be. And its past participle is potens, which, when it comes into English, means power or energy. So for us, a potentiality is a patterned use of energy which is possible of development. Now, keep in mind that whatever you are right now as human beings had to exist in potentia when you were born and when you were little babies. Whatever you are able to do now, whatever talent, skills, abilities, and things that represent you now, had to exist as a possibility when you were a baby. And nobody, not your parents, not anybody, could predict quite accurately what you would be like now. And yet all that potential was there. And the thing that defines you, in essence, is the way you use your energy. The collection of those patterns. Even if you're a frowny person, say, just to give you a tiny, funny little example, it takes energy to frown. In other words, you eat your breakfast, and a certain number of the calories from that breakfast will go into frowning all day long if you're a frowny person. And you will be known as a frowny person, and you probably have a frowny type personality too, maybe.